They had braced themselves for humiliation, for fists, for the gnawing hunger of an enemy's cage. What they received instead was the warmth of a ceramic mug pressed into their hands. Steam curled upward, rich with a smell almost forgotten in Germany, real coffee. Not the bitter barley substitute they had choked down during the war years, but the sharp, earthy scent of beans roasted somewhere deep in America's endless heartland. And beside it, waiting on a tray, a circle of fried dough glazed in sugar. A donut. For a moment, the hardened faces of soldiers cracked into disbelief. Was this some kind of trick? A cruel joke before the punishment began? They hesitated, then tasted. The first sip jolted them with its strength, black and alive on the tongue. The donut followed, sweet, soft, utterly foreign. Few had ever eaten such a thing before. Diaries would later record it as a moment burned into memory, the point at which captivity revealed itself not as nightmare, but as something they could never have imagined. Because this was not how war was supposed to feel. Propaganda had told them America was crude, impoverished, too weak and decadent to sustain its people, let alone its prisoners. Yet here, on their very first day behind American barbed wire, the enemy greeted them not with blows, but with abundance. Coffee, donuts, things so ordinary to an American child, yet so extraordinary to men who had come from years of ration cards, ersatz bread, and hunger gnawing through winter nights. Some prisoners wept quietly as they ate. Others laughed nervously, trading glances that seemed to ask, "What kind of enemy feeds us like this?" The mess hall clattered with trays, with guards moving briskly among them, not brutal but businesslike. Outside, the hum of America's untouched war machine echoed faintly. Trains in the distance, trucks rumbling down unseen roads. Inside, the taste of sugar and coffee spread like a revelation. This simple breakfast was more than food. It was the first fracture in the wall of lies they had carried across the ocean, the first glimpse of a country whose power was not only in weapons, but in the effortless luxury of feeding even its captives better than Germany could feed its own people. And as they swallowed, confusion set in. If the enemy treated them with this kind of plenty, what else about America would overturn everything they thought they knew? The answer would come soon enough, as the journey of captivity unfolded. The sweetness of coffee and donuts would linger in memory, but before that moment, there was only dread. To understand its impact, we have to go back to the long lines of prisoners shuffling toward ports in North Africa, in Italy, and along the coast of France. Columns of defeated men marched with weapons stripped away, the clatter of boots replaced by the dragging shuffle of exhaustion. They carried not only their kit bags, but the weight of uncertainty. Where were they being taken? Would they see their families again? Was this the first step toward starvation, punishment, or even execution? For many, the journey began under a sun that showed no mercy. North Africa's heat pressed down like a hammer as prisoners were herded onto Liberty ships waiting offshore. The smell of oil and salt water mixed with fear, every creak of the gangway echoing like a death sentence. Few spoke aloud. Voices carried only in whispers, the kind of hushed tones soldiers used in trenches when they thought the end was near. The sea, wide and endless, stretched before them. To be sent across it felt like exile from the world they knew. Some prisoners scribbled hurried notes into diaries before boarding. One wrote of the silence among his comrades. No one knew what awaited us. America was only a word, heavy with threat. We felt as if we were being carried away to another planet. Others tried to guess their fate. Perhaps they would be forced to build roads until they collapsed, or toil in coal mines until the war ended. The uncertainty gnawed worse than hunger. The Atlantic crossing was long, guarded by American sailors who rarely smiled, but who also did not beat or starve their captives. For men conditioned to expect cruelty, this restraint was unsettling. The ships themselves carried a strange order. Bunks stacked tightly, food distributed at regular intervals, guards pacing the decks with quiet efficiency. The prisoners noticed the cleanliness, the discipline, things they had been told Americans lacked. The first cracks of doubt began to form, though few dared to say it aloud. Nights at sea were the hardest. The groan of the hull and the crash of waves drowned out sleep. Some stared up at the steel ceiling, imagining their families in bomb-shattered cities, wondering if wives and children had food, if roofs still stood. Others thought of the stories they had been told, that Americans were savages, that capture meant torment. Every rumor returned in the darkness, magnified by the endless ocean. And yet, even during this voyage, moments of surprise slipped through. Prisoners remembered the first time cigarettes were handed out, casually, as if such luxuries meant nothing. A soldier who had not smoked in months lit one, and let the taste fill him with disbelief. Bread, soft, white, and plentiful, was served without ceremony. Some even received chocolate, the very same American chocolate bars they had been taught were symbols of decadence. Each of these small gestures cut into the fabric of fear, confusing them more than any weapon could. As the ships drew closer to the American coast, rumors began to shift. Whispers spread among the prisoners. Perhaps captivity would not mean death after all. Perhaps America was not the land of chaos and cruelty painted in propaganda, but something else entirely. Still, no one knew what awaited them once the gangplanks came down. The shoreline was hidden in mist, the future still cloaked in uncertainty. Even as the ocean carried them farther from Europe, many prisoners still heard the voice of propaganda whispering in their ears. For years, Nazi radio, pamphlets, and officers had hammered the same message into them. America was not a real nation, but a mongrel society of criminals, Jews, and blacks, too chaotic to fight with discipline, too weak to survive war. In the barracks and on the front lines, they had been told that if captured by Americans, they would be beaten, humiliated, perhaps even lynched. Those words did not vanish when the rifles were taken from their hands. They traveled with the men, heavy as the chains of defeat. One prisoner later wrote, "We thought America was a land of jazz, whiskey, and murderers. That is what they drilled into us." Another remembered the warnings of his commanding officer, that American guards would treat them as subhuman, that the United States was collapsing under crime and racial violence, that starvation was certain. And so when the ocean swallowed the European coast behind them, they looked ahead with dread. Every wave was not just distance, but confirmation of their darkest fears. The irony, of course, was that these men had fought in Hitler's armies, where discipline was absolute and disobedience could mean death. Yet in their minds, America was the opposite. A place with no order, no loyalty, no strength. It was a nation of jazz bands and skyscrapers built on sand. How, they wondered, could such a place have defeated them on the battlefield? Some whispered that Germany had lost only because of betrayal, because of numbers, because fate had turned its back. Surely not because America was stronger. But the evidence around them was hard to ignore. The ships that carried them were massive, well-built, and overflowing with supplies. The guards wore uniforms that fit, carried weapons that gleamed. Cigarettes and bread appeared without struggle, as if America's resources were endless. Even so, the old voices persisted. This is a trick. Wait until the camps. That is where the cruelty will begin. For many, this inner conflict became unbearable. One young soldier described his confusion in his diary. "We had been told they were savages. And yet they gave us food, they gave us cigarettes. I wondered, were we the savages or were they?" Still, the majority clung to the warnings they had been fed for years. Better to brace for horror than to be caught unprepared. And so, as the coastlines of America came into view at last, the men steeled themselves once more. They expected filth, hunger, and brutality waiting beyond the docks. They expected to step into chaos. What they found instead, as the gates of the camp swung open, was a shock that would strike even deeper than the coffee and donuts. The startling order, cleanliness, and almost suburban calm of American captivity. The first days of captivity were supposed to be brutal. At least, that is what the prisoners believed. Propaganda had promised them fists, whips, starvation, and endless humiliation at the hands of an undisciplined enemy. So when the Liberty ships rolled slowly out of the harbors and into the Atlantic, most men braced for misery. They whispered to each other in the bunks, voices low, preparing themselves for blows that never came. Instead, something stranger unfolded. Guards moved up and down the decks with a discipline that reminded the Germans of their own barracks, but without the cruelty. Orders were given firmly, yes, but there was no sneering, no spitting, no theatrics of power. One man wrote in his diary, "They commanded us with authority, yet without hate. It was as if they had been trained not in anger, but in procedure." The very absence of abuse was unsettling. And then came the food. They had expected watery soup and crusts of bread, if anything at all. But on the second evening, trays were carried through the mess line with white bread, soft and fresh, unlike the coarse dark loaves rationed in Germany. The prisoners stared at it as though it were a trick. Some refused at first, suspicious of poison. Others reached cautiously, only to find it tasted exactly as it looked, light, rich, and plentiful. Later, packets of American cigarettes appeared, handed out as casually as if they were nothing. A soldier who had not smoked in months lit one and closed his eyes, savoring the burn in his lungs, the first true relief he had felt since surrender. Another remembered the disbelief of seeing chocolate bars distributed to men who had expected only hunger. "We held them like treasures, afraid they would vanish. I thought, how can they give such things to prisoners, when our families starve?" These moments spread like cracks through the wall of expectation. Guards remained distant, not friendly but not cruel, as though the whole arrangement was simply part of a machine that never stopped running. To Germans raised on the idea that Americans were chaotic and savage, this efficient civility was bewildering. Some whispered theories in the dark bunks. Perhaps this was only temporary, a show before the real suffering began. Others suspected it was calculated, an attempt to soften them before worse treatment arrived. But deep down, the unease was giving way to something else, doubt. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The degenerate enemy who was supposed to despise them instead gave them bread, cigarettes, and even chocolate. They were being fed better on the open sea than many of their families back in Germany. And with each passing day, that truth gnawed at them more than hunger ever could. By the time the ships drew close to the American shore, the prisoners no longer felt certain about anything. The old certainties of propaganda were fraying fast, but no one yet dared admit it aloud. They still expected the nightmare to begin the moment their boots hit American soil. What awaited them instead was a sight that would shatter their fears even further: the strange calm and order of the camps themselves. When the ships finally edged into American harbors, the prisoners pressed against portholes and railings, their eyes scanning a landscape that felt impossibly far from the war. There were no bombed-out ruins, no smoldering chimneys or shattered bridges. Instead, they saw skylines intact, cranes moving busily across shipyards, trucks rumbling down clean roads. Factories puffed smoke in thick, steady columns. Not from destruction, but from production. For men who had left behind cities reduced to rubble, this first glimpse of an untouched America was like stepping into another world. The journey inland deepened the shock. Guarded trains rolled past endless fields of corn and wheat, barns painted bright red, small towns dotted with neat white houses and church steeples. Children waved as the train clattered by, some laughing, some curious, but none afraid. To the prisoners, who had grown used to the silence of fear in occupied Europe, this casual cheerfulness was baffling. One recalled later, "I thought, surely we must still be dreaming. No land at war could look so calm, so alive." Then came the camps themselves. The men braced as the gates swung open, expecting mud, filth, and barbed wire misery. What they found instead looked almost like small towns transplanted into the countryside. Rows of wooden barracks stood in orderly lines, roofs intact and freshly painted. Mess halls gleamed with long tables scrubbed clean. Some camps even had libraries, theaters, and baseball fields laid out with chalk-white lines. The air carried not the stench of decay, but the faint scent of cut grass. Prisoners exchanged uncertain glances as they stepped inside. Guards barked orders, yes, but not with the venom they had feared. The rules were strict, yet carried out with a sense of routine rather than cruelty. To men raised on military rigidity and propaganda visions of barbaric Americans, this efficiency felt strange, almost polite. One diary entry captured the disbelief. "It looked more like a summer camp than a prison." Even the barbed wire seemed less threatening. Beyond the fences lay farmland stretching endlessly, tractors plowing without pause, farmers waving from the distance. The contrast was unbearable. Back home, families were struggling for scraps, cities in ruins, trains halted for lack of fuel. Here, abundance hummed quietly, even for the enemy's prisoners. It was the first time many realized something profound. America had not merely survived the war, it was thriving through it. And this realization unsettled them more than captivity itself. But the real transformation would not come from the sight of buildings or the hum of tractors. It would come in the mess hall, when the clatter of trays introduced them to a simple meal that would redefine captivity itself: coffee steaming in mugs, and donuts warm with sugar. That moment was waiting just around the corner. The first days in camp brought a rhythm that the prisoners could never have imagined. Morning bells, the shuffle to the mess hall, the clatter of trays sliding down a line of steaming food. It was here, at mealtimes, that the deepest shock settled in, because the meals were not rations. They were feasts. Eggs appeared in shining yellow mounds, scrambled in quantities so large they seemed to come from another world. Meat, thick cuts of beef, slices of pork, sometimes even chicken, was ladled onto plates with an ease that made the Germans blink. Bowls of vegetables, potatoes, and fresh fruit stood in long rows, replenished before they ever ran empty. And there was milk, cold and plentiful, poured into metal cups until it spilled over. The prisoners looked at one another in disbelief. Many had not seen milk in years. At home, their families queued for hours for a thin loaf of bread, or stretched watery soup through the week. Ersatz coffee, powdered starches, and scraps had been their reality. Here, in the custody of their enemies, the tables overflowed. One man scrawled in his journal, "We eat better as prisoners of war than as soldiers of the Reich. Even the children at home do not eat like this." Some felt shame as they swallowed, the weight of guilt sitting heavier than the food itself. They imagined their wives boiling turnip peels into soup while they cut into beef, imagined their children hungry while they drank milk to the brim. The abundance was not simply comforting, it was humiliating, a reminder of everything their nation could not provide. Others reacted with wonder, whispering in disbelief at how casually the Americans treated this wealth. Food was served without ceremony, without a sense that it was rare or precious. Guards and cooks moved through the hall, as if feeding thousands of men 3 times a day was nothing extraordinary. To the prisoners, it was a revelation of power. A country that could afford to feed its enemies like this must have resources beyond imagination. Letters home, when they were allowed, were filled with hints of this shock. Some prisoners wrote cautiously, careful not to sound too admiring. Others confessed openly, "Do not worry for me. I eat more here than I did in the army. I am ashamed to say it, but it is true. The meals became a symbol of something larger than survival. They revealed that America's strength did not lie only in tanks and planes, but in a deeper foundation. A land so abundant that it could extend comfort even to those who had come to destroy it. Each bite of meat, each spoonful of vegetables, was a reminder that the war was not only about armies, but about systems, and in this system, America had already won. And yet, food was only one layer of the revelation. As the days stretched on, it wasn't just what the prisoners tasted, but what they heard that began to reshape their understanding of the world beyond the barbed wire. At first, it was the silence that struck them. No air raid sirens, no distant thud of bombs, no mournful whistles of trains evacuating the wounded. The nights in America were still, broken only by the steady chorus of crickets or the hum of a far-off engine. For men who had lived years on edge, listening for the next explosion, the absence of destruction was almost eerie. But slowly, new sounds crept in, sounds that felt like another planet. From beyond the barbed wire came the rhythmic whistle of freight trains running without pause, hauling goods across the continent. Unlike the broken rails of Germany, here the trains seemed endless, their horns echoing like proof of a machine that never stopped working. Factories, too, sent their voices across the landscape, low industrial rumbles by day, sharp whistles signaling shift changes. For the prisoners, these noises told a story. This was not a country stretched thin by war. It was a country swelling with energy. Sometimes, on clear evenings, music floated over from the guardhouses. Jazz, swing, big band tunes crackling through radios. The Germans gathered in clusters, straining to catch every note. The syncopated rhythms, the brassy horns, the laughing voices of singers. It was the sound of a culture unbroken, carefree even in wartime. One recalled later, "We had been told America was uncultured, chaotic. But when I heard that music, I realized they were free in a way we had never been." The camps themselves began to hum with this new rhythm. Guards whistled casually as they walked patrols, a habit unimaginable in the rigid German army. Workers in nearby fields shouted greetings, their voices carrying across the wire with warmth rather than hostility. Children's laughter sometimes reached the camp from neighboring farms, an almost unbearable sound for men whose own children were huddled in air raid shelters back home. Radios inside the camp played news bulletins, entertainment programs, and baseball games. To German ears, the sport was incomprehensible, yet the enthusiasm in the announcer's voice fascinated them. The pace of the commentary, the roar of invisible crowds, it gave a sense of a society where leisure continued despite global war. One prisoner wrote, "It was strange, hearing sport and laughter while Europe lay in ruins. For us, war consumed every part of life. For them, it was something fought far away." These sounds chipped away at the idea of America as a grim, desperate land. Instead, the auditory world of Captivity revealed a nation alive with confidence, motion, and joy.